Okay, hi friends. I am back ready to do John chapter 5, and this is my friend Jen.
Hi.
And we're here in Boston where she lives. Jen went to Moffat High School, for those of you that watch that went to Moffat High School. And she also did a chapter from Luke with me a few years back. So here I am in Boston again. We had a really good time today. We went to downtown. We went on the Freedom Trail and saw all kinds of wonderful historical sites. We ate at a seaside restaurant, and we went to one of my favorite stores. So anyway, we've had a really good time.
Nice.
Yeah, and
my kids got to come along.
Yeah,
so my two girls. It was fun.
Anyway, I was excited for the chance to get to teach with Jen. I told you about it a couple weeks ago that I was going to hopefully do this. So
here we are.
Yeah, so we're going to go through chapter 5. The first 18 verses, and it deals with a healing that Jesus did by the pool of Bethesda. So let me read it, and then we're going to back up and go through it verse by verse. So after these things, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porticos. In these lay a multitude of those who were sick, blind, lame, and withered, waiting for the moving of the waters. For an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and stirred up the water. Whoever then first, after the stirring up of the water, stepped in was made well from whatever disease with which he was afflicted. A man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been a long time in that condition, he said to him, "Do you wish to get well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, but while I am coming, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your pallet and walk." Immediately the man became well and picked up his pallet and began to walk. Now it was the Sabbath on that day. So the Jews were saying to the man who was cured, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not permissible for you to carry your pallet." But he answered them, "He who made me well was the one who said to me, 'Pick up your pallet and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Pick up your pallet and walk'?" But the man who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had slipped away while there was a crowd in that place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "Behold, you have become well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. For this reason, the Jews were persecuting Jesus because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But he answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I myself am working." For this reason, therefore, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he not only was breaking the Sabbath, but also was calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. So anyway, I know this book isn't completely in chronological order, but remember, I believe the temple cleansing that we read about was before this. And remember, I told you guys that Annas would remember the temple cleansing, the Jewish leaders, and they knew who Jesus was. And so keep that in mind. And also his public ministry had started, so he had been doing miracles and stuff, and word gets around. So yeah, so Jen, before we even get started, are there any initial thoughts you want to share, or should we just jump in with verse 1?
We can jump in and comment as we go along.
Right. We had a lot of thoughts, a lot of conversations about this. Both of John is my favorite gospel, and it is Jen's favorite gospel.
Favorite
so
yeah.
After these things, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now remember, Jerusalem is on a set of hills. And that's what they mean by up. It's not, they actually go south from Galilee, but it's up in elevation. And also, a lot of people think the feast was the Feast of Tabernacles. Yeah, it was a required feast of the Jews. But remember, they did the Passover, they did the Feast of Booths. Jen looked up all the different feasts. But a lot of people speculate that it might have been the Feast of Tabernacles.
We couldn't find out. We couldn't pin it down, but that's what we speculate that's what it was.
Yeah. And then now they're in Jerusalem by the sheep gate, a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porticos. Do you want to describe the porticos? They're like awnings.
Yeah. So basically it's just a covering to keep people out of the elements, basically, not entirely. but it was something to give them shelter.
Yeah, kind of like an awning.
Yeah,
so,
like an awning.
And they excavated this pool in the late 1800s. And before that, some people said that John was lying because they never found the pool. Well, they found it eventually.
Yeah.
And proof that it was. And it's very large. And you can see it if you go to Jerusalem, or you can just Google it and check it out. But they call that the sheep gate. It's the easternmost gate. And they kept sheep out of there. And we read that
Bethesda,
which means mercy,
Gate of Mercy.
Gate of Mercy.
Gate of Mercy.
And that they would bring the sheep in. That the water in Bethesda also served the temple.
Yes.
And then they would wash the sheep with that.
Yes.
So for temple sacrifice or whatever. In these lay a multitude of those who were sick, blind, lame, and withered, waiting for the moving of the waters. So let's read the next one, and then we can talk on it, Jen. Okay. An angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and stirred up the water. Whoever then first, after the stirring of the water, stepped in and was made well from whatever disease with which he was afflicted. Do you want to talk about
So we talked about that that's disputed, possibly. There's a little controversy that, maybe this portion of the scripture was added in at a later time, and it was a little folklore that there was an angel of the Lord. So my belief is we have to go on faith when we believe that. And I believe that, because how else are people going to truly be healed? Like, how are these miraculous healings being they're being documented throughout the times if these people truly hadn't been healed? I believe that wouldn't have been put in the Bible if there wasn't some kind of intervention by God happening during this time. Right.
And I know, like, one guy we read, he said he didn't need angels, he needed Jesus. Of course, but I have always believed that an angel came down and stirred the waters.
Yeah, it's a messenger of God.
I didn't think it was folklore.
Yeah.
And some people do think it's folklore.
And
that was just their belief.
Right.
But if people weren't being healed, why did they all gather there?
Right.
I mean, some people must have been healed.
For years, this had been going on.
Right.
So obviously there was some kind of belief that it really was healing waters.
Right. So anyway, right. And it was the first person that would step into the waters that were healed.
It was the first person. So I think that's a really significant point, is that it wasn't everyone. It was the first person, which as we go along in the scriptures, you'll understand why that's important.
Right. So do you want to read 5 and 6, Jen?
Sure. So verse 5, a man was there who had been ill for 38 years. Now, we're not sure if it was the entire, that was his whole life, but he'd been there for 38 years.
Yeah.
Verse 6, when Jesus saw him lying there and knew he had already been a long time in that condition, he said to him, do you wish to get well?
I think we should read through 9 and then discuss
I'll say, absolutely. Okay, so verse 9, immediately.
Or the whole down through verse 9, like starting with 7.
You want me to start with 7 again?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, because this is pretty significant. So this verse 7, the sick man answered him, Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, but while I am coming, another steps down before me. Verse 8, Jesus said to him, Get up, pick up your pallet and walk. Verse 9, immediately the man became well and picked up his pallet and began to walk.
Yeah. So it's so exciting. So 38 years of being ill, I think he was pretty down and out. So, and we talked about, like, what could his illness have been. My assumption is he couldn't walk because Jesus told him to get up, take up his pallet and walk. And then he needed someone to put him into the pool. Yeah. So, but we don't know what his illness was or what caused it, but there's clues to what might have caused it.
So later. I did some comparisons. I love to do comparisons of different versions of the Bible. I think it's kind of important just to see what the other versions say and maybe get just a little bit more perspective on it. And they all were very similar. A couple of them would call him an invalid. And I work in the medical field, and I pretty much know, what an invalid could be, and that's a very broad term. So could he have been paralyzed and not be able to walk, which I know Ginger is firm on, and I have been, but I started to rethink it after reading some of the other versions, and I thought, it is possible he could have been able to walk and just was very weak due to his illness and had a very difficult time. How did he get to the pool? Did someone bring him there? He's having clearly a hard time being the first one in the pool because he was waiting on other people to put him in the pool, so that could have indicated that he couldn't get in the pool. So, as we go along, I guess that's a kind of an important point to keep in mind.
Yeah, and you wonder how Jesus picked him out. Now, Jesus is God, and the part of him that is God, like John focuses on his godhood, right, knows things because he's the creator. And we talked about how he's the creator. Yeah. But Jesus was always also human. He was also fully man. So, I'm sorry. Yeah, I just want to back up to verse 7 a little bit too and elaborate on that a bit. So, when Jesus asks him, "Do you wish to get well?" And we talked about this.
Yeah, and I always found this very fascinating in this passage. And the sick man answered, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I am coming, another steps down before me." So he never answered him directly. So in my estimation, I look at this as Jesus saying, kind of a yes or no answer. Do you want to get well? It's kind of straightforward.
And he doesn't say, yes, I do.
He doesn't say yes,
that.
I do. I don't want to get well, because clearly the man does. He keeps going down to the pool. So he just kind of gives him almost kind of like an excuse, not really maybe an excuse, an explanation, an excuse, however you want to look at it, but he doesn't give him a straightforward answer. But however, Jesus decides to heal him anyway.
Yeah. And there's so much to that.
There's so much to that.
I used to always think this man is making up excuses. If I were sick that long, I'd find a way in that pool. But then I've always thought that, like, because when Jesus says, "Do you wish to get well?" I almost thought, well, some people, Jen works in the medical field, and we're not picking anybody who's having a health problem. Please don't take it that way. Jen has seen people that don't want to get well.
It's hard for people. There's some people that I encounter a lot of people. Full disclosure, I work as a paramedic. So I'm in people's homes, I'm taking them to the hospital, and some people I encounter multiple times, and there are some people that just don't want to get well. So it was interesting he didn't come out outright and say yes. He just said, well, no one's helping me to get into the pool, but he kept coming back to the pool.
Yeah.
And I see people, keep going back to the hospital, but then they wind up in their same condition, but they go back to the hospital. But Jesus chose to heal this man.
Yeah, despite
and the man,
what his mental state was.
Right.
Still.
And the man accepted it.
Yeah.
He accepted it, which says, I think, something pretty significant. So he didn't have to get into the water to get healed.
Right.
Jesus healed him and he accepted it, and he had to accept it on faith because, as we go along, we'll know he didn't know Jesus at that time.
Exactly. Now it also says now it was the Sabbath day on that day. Now, if the Jewish Sabbath goes from Friday night to Saturday night, is it dusk to
It's dusk to dusk.
Okay.
Yeah, I lived in a Jewish town. Sharon was a Jewish town. So,
yeah, dusk to dusk.
I have Jewish blood, so I've read up. So it's dusk to dusk.
Yeah, and when I was in Israel, it was that way. And so, like, when I was in Israel, they couldn't do work on the Sabbath day if they were Orthodox. Like there's an Orthodox community. And so like we would never drive through, when I was there, through the Orthodox community on Sabbath because they would stone you, which is kind of ironic because if they're picking up stones and throwing them at you, isn't that kind of like work? But
interesting. Yeah.
But we did see an Orthodox man, and you can tell them by their dress. And we did see an Orthodox man carrying his Bible, his Torah or whatever, on the Sabbath. And some guy in our group noticed it, and he's like, that man's carrying his scriptures on the Sabbath.
Can't do that.
Right. But anyway.
When I lived in this Jewish town locally years ago, We had a lot of Orthodox Jews in the town. It was probably 65-70% Jews. And they would literally have a string that they would line across like the telephone poles. And it was like a 5-mile radius. And the only thing they were allowed to do on the Sabbath was to go out and walk, which at this time, now this is modern day times, they were allowed to walk on the Sabbath, but only within that perimeter were they allowed to walk,
Right.
and they weren't allowed to do any other work. So we would see the Orthodox Jews out walking
Right.
at times during the Sabbath.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah. So that the fact that it was on the Sabbath day, and these religious leaders, not nice people.
No.
Very controlling of everyone. Remember, they had their own, we called it the oral law. We talked about it when we studied Exodus, I guess. Yeah, and the Jews had a lot of laws that were extra biblical from the Old Testament. And you know, Jesus, he will claim later that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. Yes. The Sabbath wasn't made for, or the Sabbath was made, how does it go, Jen? Sabbath was made for man.
It's made for man. It's not made for God. God gives it to us as a gift for rest.
Right. For rest.
He wants us to truly rest. And, you know, like true rest, not like, okay, I'm just going to, you know, sit back on, you know, watch TV, watch movies. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
You know, but not doing any kind of, you know, true work, physical labor, you know, just to rest your body and rest your mind and rest your soul.
Right.
That's what it's meant for.
And, you know, we talked about this when I did the book of Luke as well. There's more to the Sabbath than just what it first started at. Sabbath is like, you know, it's a day of rest, but entering into faith in Jesus Christ is a rest from our works.
Yes. Jesus is our Sabbath.
Yeah, Jesus is our Sabbath.
Jesus is our
and we're not under the law. So
Yes.
If people work on Sunday, it's not an issue.
And sometimes I have to work on
because
Sunday,
she's a paramedic. People do have accidents and things on the Sabbath.
Illnesses. And,
right. So anyway,
but
and
the Lord
we Christians don't really worship on the Sabbath anyway.
Right.
We worship on Sunday because that's when Jesus rose from the dead.
That's right.
So, right.
That's
so anyway.
Resurrection.
Yeah.
Resurrection
so there's
Day.
a lot to it, I guess. Okay, verse 10. So the Jews were saying to the man who was cured, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not permissible for you to carry your pallet." They were getting after him, like, don't you be doing that on the Sabbath, right? Not letting people have the freedom to mind their own darn business. It wasn't like that, right? And abusive leaders basically taking advantage. I'm gonna read through
13.
Yeah. But he answered him, "He who made me well was the one who said to me, 'Pick up your pallet and walk.' They asked him, 'Who is the man who said to you, pick up your pallet and walk?' But the man who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had slipped away while there was a crowd in that place." Comment, Jen.
All right. So, I think what's very interesting about this is the man who was healed did not know who Jesus was in the beginning, which is very fascinating when you think about it, because he trusted him.
Yeah.
Think about it. He didn't even know who he was. It sounds like he hadn't even heard about Jesus. You know, he had speculated it was Jesus, but he never asked him. And so he tells the Jewish leaders, "I don't know who he is, but this is just what he told me to do, so I did it."
Right.
You know?
And
I felt the need to do it.
Yeah.
And Jesus had slipped away, so he obviously didn't want to be identified. You know, at that time, he didn't want to be identified. And then when we go down into verse 12, or into verse 13, excuse me. But the man who was healed did not know who he was at that time. He had slipped away into the crowd.
Right.
So he obviously did not want to be identified at that time.
Right. And you know, Jesus, sometimes he could hardly move from place to place when people...
Right.
When there was healing, I mean, people would crowd in and stuff like that, which is understandable. Everybody wants to be healed, right? So, but we talked about this, how it was interesting that Jesus didn't say, "Be healed." He said, "Pick up your pallet and walk."
He commanded him.
Yeah.
He gave him a command.
Right.
And the man responded to it.
And he did. And he did. And you know, Jesus, when he said that, he basically was commanding the man to carry his pallet on a Sabbath, which was not allowed.
Which was also not allowed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Jesus would know that, being a Jew.
Right.
And knowing the leaders, and the man responded in obedience, knowing that it would not be kosher with the leaders.
Right. He knew that. He
He obeyed Jesus. He did what Jesus said.
Yeah.
So,
because Jesus is not legalistic.
Right.
Like the Jewish leaders.
Yeah. So we found that to be fascinating. Is there anything
And then
else
14.
there?
That's it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the Jewish leaders confronted him.
They're just questioning him. They're questioning
and they want to know,
him.
who is this? Now, remember, they knew who Jesus was. The temple cleansing, the miracles, and he's not even well into his ministry yet, but there's enough going on that they knew who he was.
They were probably, we speculate that the Jewish leaders were suspecting it.
Yeah, they might have been suspecting him because of what they've been hearing. And he had been doing other miracles, too, at these festivals. So where are we at?
14.
14, you go to 14.
Okay.
Let's do...
You want to start 13 into 14, 15?
Yeah, maybe through 16 even. Yeah, maybe through 16.
Should I back up to 13?
Sure.
All right, so back to 13. But the man who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had slipped away while there was a crowd in that place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "Behold, you have become well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you." Happens to you. Which I find fascinating because
maybe we should stop there and talk.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think we might want to address that just briefly.
Yeah.
Because he's once again giving him a command, but he's giving him something that is going to help him for the rest of his life. You know, it's you've been, obviously there's some kind of sin going on in your life, and Jesus is saying if you stop doing this, then bad things will stop happening to you, but if you continue on, they will. Mm-hmm. So now you have another choice to make.
Right.
So you chose to obey me the first time. I'm giving you another command, and it seems like Jesus was very excited for him. Mm-hmm. You have been healed. Yeah. So let's keep your healing going and make it even better.
Don't let anything worse happen.
But don't let anything worse happen.
Not intentionally.
Not intentionally. Just
so
stop sinning.
I think this man's now lots of illnesses are not caused from your sin or my sin. Right.
We live in a fallen world.
Adam and Eve did cause sin
to
come into the world and cause sickness for all of us.
Right.
So in a way, it fell on the first man, Adam, and Jesus is the second Adam.
Yes.
But every sickness ultimately goes back to when they ate that fruit. So that's when sickness entered the world. Now, many people who are sick or suffering, it's not from what they did necessarily. But there are some health problems that are caused by sin.
Right.
So, a lot of people, because of their drug and alcohol abuse, have developed serious health problems. Or, like they
eat terrible foods and let themselves get overweight, and they don't exercise, or they know that there's hereditary heart disease in the family, and they're eating foods that can, bring that on, and if it's already in your genes, you're just kind of playing with fire that way. So I look at it that way.
It could be worse than too.
Yeah, and it could be worse than too.
It could be like
It could be maybe
self-abuse, like you're hurting yourself.
Self-abuse, or could be some kind of sexual sin. That's causing
that you caught gonorrhea
disease.
from. Or something.
You're getting STDs from it. And God heals you from that. And don't go back to that lifestyle
because something worse might happen.
Same with like she said, drug addicts. Unfortunately, I'm around people who are drug addicted. And, and it's like, well, you're causing these problems yourself.
Right.
And I know it's not that easy to stop, but if you ask God for healing and you really mean it in your heart, God is willing to heal.
Well, and this man, he was obviously able to quit doing whatever he was doing.
Yeah.
Because Jesus wouldn't have told him to quit doing it if he wasn't able.
Right.
Even mentally.
He picked up his pallet and he walked.
Right.
So he knew he had the faith.
Yeah. And we kind of felt like the healing was more than just physical. It was spiritual. It was mental.
Yes.
Because he just obeyed Jesus when he'd been laying there for 38. And he was willing to go against those mean, hateful religious leaders.
Yep.
And that was not a safe thing to do.
Right.
He was willing to go against them to obey Jesus. And they were, the elite people.
Right.
He was willing to obey Jesus over them.
Yeah.
And that seemed like real faith to us. We don't know exactly his faith about being saved from his sin, but Jesus is letting him know that something worse could happen if you continue doing what you're doing.
Right. So,
And Jesus wouldn't have told him, do not sin anymore, if he wasn't continuing to do it.
So nothing worse happens to you.
Yeah, he must have been continuing to
warning
do
him.
what was causing his health problems, or Jesus wouldn't have warned him not to.
Yeah, he was warning him.
Because in other passages, I don't remember, it's not coming to me exactly, but when Jesus heals like a blind man or a deaf man or something, and the disciples are like, what did that man do to cause this? And Jesus said he didn't do anything to cause this. It wasn't him or his parents that caused this. So, but in this man, it was his sin that caused it.
It was his sin that caused it.
Yeah, I think that's clear. Yeah. Okay, so verse 15.
15.
The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. I think we should comment right there.
Absolutely.
He searched those leaders out and said it was Jesus who made me well.
He wanted them to know who it was.
Yeah. And that was not a safe thing to do.
No.
And I think him being willing to share that, it was almost like witnessing to people who could hurt you. Who could kick you out of the temple.
He had a
who
lot
could get
of
you
courage.
disowned.
Yeah.
And we also saw a bigger part of that. Well, let me go ahead and finish 16:2. For this reason, the Jews were persecuting Jesus because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But he answered him, my Father is working till now, and I myself am working. Jesus said that. For this reason, therefore, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he not only was breaking the Sabbath, but he was calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God, revealing his God.
And that was blasphemy.
And they
to them
knew, I believe that they knew that he's claiming to be the Messiah.
They
the Savior
considered that blasphemy. So this was like a tipping point.
And we
now.
felt like, part of the miracle had to do with healing this man and personal ministry. And God knew, or Jesus, being God, knew who to go to. He could have picked anybody out.
Right.
And we don't know if he healed other people, but it just mentions this man, and then it mentions him slipping away. So at that moment, he probably didn't heal anybody else. And then, but part of it too, I think, was that Jesus, knowing his future, having to die to pay for our sins, was almost setting the leaders up to come after him.
Yeah.
Because unless they go after him and have the desire to kill him, and I believe they wanted to kill him.
They wanted to kill him.
They were sitting around fantasizing and dreaming about how they could kill him. Yeah. And it's going to get worse. It's going to ramp up and ramp up and ramp up. But as Jesus does these things and the man goes and tells them, I wouldn't doubt that the Holy Spirit didn't prompt the man to go tell them.
Yeah.
Because eventually Jesus has to die to pay for our sins. And the madder they get, the more they are determined to kill him. So I think in the big picture, Jesus is setting up his own death. But what do you think?
Yeah, there had to be a setup.
Right.
And this was being set up.
Yeah. So
No doubt in my mind.
Right, because Jesus went willingly to the cross. So, that's kind of what we're thinking. Do you have any final comments, Jen?
No, I think we covered it.
Yeah.
I think we covered it. But I just encourage y'all just to, read it for yourselves.
Listen to somebody else teach it.
Listen to someone else teach it. Read it in different versions if you can. You can always go online. There's apps where you can, if you don't have different Bibles with different translations, you can go online and find them and just compare them for yourself to give you a little deeper understanding, or maybe it'll just look the same to you, but just pray for wisdom, pray for knowledge, pray for God to give you the clarity to really understand what he's speaking to you through his Holy Spirit.
Yeah. All right, thank you, Jen.
All right,
and
thank you,
I will
Ginger.
see you guys next week.